right. Welcome back, everyone. You know we love to get philosophical here on the deep dive.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure to be back and digging into some dense concepts.
And today, we're tackling a big one,
Ugh.
privacy. Specifically, privacy in medicine, which, for a philosopher like you and our listeners, it really gets to the core of what it means to be a person, right?
It does. We're looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on this topic.
So it's going to be a dense one.
Buckle up.
Let's dive right in. The first thing the encyclopedia unpacks is the concept of informational privacy in a medical context.
Right, and I think the first thing that jumps to mind for most people is confidentiality, which is obviously hugely important.
Absolutely. We expect our healthcare providers to keep our medical information private. And that expectation is backed up by both ethical guidelines, like from organizations like the APA and AMFT,
Right.
and by law.
Yeah. But looking at it from a philosophical perspective, things get a lot more nuanced. I mean, is confidentiality just an individual right? Some philosophers, like Mohapatra and Wiley, argue that it's not just about the individual, it's relational.
Okay, interesting. How so?
Well, they point out that there's often a whole network of people involved in a patient's care. Family members, friends, support systems, all of those relationships play a role.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's not just about keeping secrets from the outside world, it's also about navigating those internal dynamics.
Right. And on the flip side, you have philosophers like Allen who argue that strict confidentiality rules can actually put a burden on physicians. Like this burden of silence, even when it might be beneficial to share information with family members or caregivers.
That's a really good point.
It's definitely something to consider.
I can see how navigating that could be really tricky. So we've got these different perspectives on what confidentiality is and who it involves. But why is it so important in the first place? The encyclopedia lays out some pretty compelling arguments.
Yeah. From a utilitarian perspective, which is all about maximizing good outcomes, the argument for confidentiality is pretty clear.
People are much more likely to seek treatment and be honest with their doctors if they know their information will be kept private.
Exactly. Think about it. If you were worried about your medical information becoming public, you'd probably be less likely to disclose everything. Especially, if it was something sensitive or potentially embarrassing.
Right, like a mental health issue or something related to sexual health, you'd be hesitant to bring it up at all.
Yeah, and that can have real consequences for both individual and public health. Like people might delay getting treatment, conditions might worsen, and healthcare costs could go up.
Makes sense. So there's a very practical reason for confidentiality.
Absolutely. But there's also a strong deontological argument for it. Deontology is all about moral duties, and some philosophers, like Peirce and Benn, argue that respecting patient privacy is a fundamental duty that stems from recognizing a patient's inherent dignity and vulnerability.
So it's not just about outcomes. It's about treating people with respect, regardless of the consequences.
Exactly. And the work of Lakoff and Johnson highlights how our bodily and mental experiences are deeply personal and often incredibly vulnerable. They're tied to our sense of self in a very profound way.
Absolutely. And because of that vulnerability, privacy becomes a kind of shield.
Yes. Protection.
It protects us from discrimination, shame, and the stigma that unfortunately still surrounds certain health conditions, especially mental health conditions.
Yeah.
And this is something that's really emphasized in ethical codes, like those from the APA and AAMFT.
Right. And Dixon, in his work, talks a lot about this protective function of privacy.
It's crucial. And this leads us to the question of control, right? Do patients have the right to control their own medical information? Philosophers like McGuire, Martin, Laurie, and Rothstein delve into this.
Yeah, the idea of patient ownership of their medical data.
And this gets into even bigger questions about the role of government.
Absolutely. Like, what right does the government have to collect and manage our personal health information? And how do we ensure that those practices are fair and just? There are definitely some parallels here with debates around data privacy in the digital world.
Oh, for sure. It's a huge topic right now.
It is.
But thinking about the doctor-patient relationship, it's not just about rights and regulations, is it?
No, not at all. Virtue ethics brings a whole other dimension to the conversation.
Philosophers like Radin and Waldman emphasize the importance of virtues like trust and reserve in this context.
Radin talks about reserve as sort of a sense of appropriate boundaries.
Oh, interesting. Like knowing what to share and what to keep private.
Exactly. And they argue that these virtues are essential for fostering a strong and ethical patient-provider relationship. Especially in sensitive fields like mental health care, Waldman sees trust as absolutely fundamental to informational privacy.
And that makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, we need to be able to trust our healthcare providers to be discreet and to handle our information with care.
Right. And then there's the question of how confidentiality applies to research, which is a whole other area of ethical complexity.
Yeah, research is obviously crucial for advancing medical knowledge, but it also raises some serious privacy concerns.
Absolutely. And there are strict ethical guidelines in place to protect the privacy of research subjects.
Like institutional review boards, or IRBs, which review research proposals to make sure they meet ethical standards.
Right. And things like anonymization and the use of identifiers to protect individual identities. But as Newcomb points out, even when data is used for statistical analysis, there are still potential privacy concerns. Like, could groups be identified based on the data? It's not always straightforward.
Yeah, I can see how that could be a slippery slope. And the encyclopedia also points out how our understanding of harm in this area is evolving. We used to focus primarily on the harms of privacy invasion, like the potential for subordination or injustice.
Right, but now there's also a growing recognition of the potential harms that can come from voluntary self-disclosure.
So even if someone chooses to share their medical information publicly, there can still be negative consequences.
Exactly. Think about those examples we see more and more these days, like people webcasting their childbirth experiences or sharing videos of their mastectomies. It's great that people feel empowered to share those experiences, but it also raises questions about the potential for exploitation, the pressure to perform, and the commodification of very personal experiences.
That's a really important point. It's like, just because you can share something doesn't mean you should. It's all about weighing those potential harms and benefits.
Right.
And it's also important to remember that confidentiality isn't absolute.
Yeah, that's right.
There are some exceptions, like reporting child abuse or neglect or warning someone if a patient poses a credible threat to them. That's the Tarasoff rule.
Mm.
And then there are situations involving public health, like reporting contagious diseases.
Right. And those exceptions really highlight the tension between individual rights and the well-being of the community. How do you balance the right to privacy with the need to prevent harm to others? It's a classic ethical dilemma.
Definitely. It's a tough one.
It is. And then there's the issue of secrecy, which Bach defines as intentional concealment. Like when a patient decides to keep certain symptoms or conditions hidden from their healthcare provider.
And that can happen for all sorts of reasons.
Right.
Fear of judgment, discrimination, maybe they're just embarrassed.
Exactly. Or it could be the healthcare provider withholding information from the patient, like that whole paternalistic doctor knows best mentality that we've thankfully moved away from. And then there's the whole ethical quagmire of incidental findings in research.
Incidental findings.
Yeah, like imagine a researcher is studying something completely unrelated to, say, heart disease. But in the course of their research, they discover that one of their participants has a potentially serious heart condition. Do they have an obligation to tell that person, even if it might cause anxiety or distress? It's a tricky situation.
That is a really tough one. So many layers to consider. And then, of course, we can't talk about privacy in medicine without talking about electronic health records.
Right. They've revolutionized healthcare in so many ways, but they've also created a whole new set of challenges around data protection and security.
We have laws like HIPAA in the United States, which aim to regulate how this information is collected, stored, and shared. But let's be honest, digital data is inherently vulnerable.
Yeah.
It's so easy to transfer, so easy to hack. And the consequences of a data breach can be really serious.
Absolutely. And the encyclopedia notes that some types of medical data are considered particularly sensitive and get even stronger legal protections, like information about HIV/AIDS, mental health conditions, and genetic information which is protected in the U.S. by GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act.
Right.
But philosophically, this brings up the question of how we even define harm in the context of a data breach. Is it just about financial loss or identity theft? Or is there also a harm in having your most private medical information exposed to the world, even if no one actually uses it against you?
Like the emotional distress and the erosion of trust.
Exactly.
It can be devastating.
It can.
Okay. And related to that, we have the concept of anonymity, which becomes particularly important in public health and research.
Right. And there are important distinctions to make between identifiable data, de-identified data, and truly anonymized data. And achieving true anonymity can be really challenging.
Especially with the amount of data that's being collected these days. It feels like everything is connected.
It is. And those historical debates around anonymous HIV/AIDS testing really highlight the tension between individual privacy and the need for effective public health surveillance. How do you track a disease without potentially outing people who might not want to be identified? It's a tough balance to strike.
It is, and then we've seen this increasing emphasis on accountability when it comes to sharing health information.
Oh, yeah. Especially during those big public health crises like pandemics.
Right.
You have mandatory reporting of certain diseases, mandatory testing. And while those measures are often necessary for protecting public health, they can also have a huge impact on individual privacy
They
rights.
do.
And this is especially true for vulnerable populations who might be more reliant on government assistance. It raises all sorts of philosophical questions about the limits of state power and the conditions under which it's okay to infringe on privacy.
So we've been talking about informational privacy, but the encyclopedia also delves into the idea of professional norms.
Right. And this is really about the ethical guidelines that govern the day-to-day practices of healthcare
Like
professionals.
not gossiping about patients on social media or making sure medical records are physically secure.
Exactly.
There was that case at Johns Hopkins a few years ago where a doctor secretly recorded patients during pelvic exams. It's a stark reminder that these ethical norms can be violated, and when they are, the consequences can be huge.
Which I can.
There's also a lot of debate right now about the use of video and audio recording in medical practice.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is it okay to routinely record patient interactions?
It's a good question. On the one hand, it could potentially improve accuracy and accountability. But on the other hand, it could really undermine patient privacy and make people feel like they're constantly being watched.
It's like the privacy concerns we have with surveillance cameras and facial recognition technology, but in a medical setting.
Exactly. It's a really interesting ethical debate that's still unfolding.
Okay, so moving on from informational privacy, the encyclopedia also dives into the concept of physical privacy. And while it may not have received as much explicit philosophical attention, it's super important for patients.
It really is. I mean, it's all about respecting patients' feelings of modesty, their need for solitude, and their right to bodily integrity.
Solitude is such an interesting one
It is.
because it's so valuable for people who are going through illness and making difficult treatment decisions. It gives them space to reflect, to process, but it's also a delicate balance because sometimes people who are sick really crave connection too.
It is a delicate balance, and the need for solitude can be especially acute for people who are nearing the end of life. They may want to be with loved ones, but they also might need time alone to come to terms with what's happening.
And then there's bodily modesty, which is so culturally and religiously specific.
Yeah, it really varies from person to person.
But it's something that healthcare providers are generally very mindful of. They provide gowns, they try to limit exposure during exams, and they often offer the option of a same-sex provider.
Right. But sometimes those preferences clash with practical realities, like if there's only one doctor available or if a procedure requires a certain level of exposure, it can be hard to navigate those situations.
Yeah, for sure.
And then we have the concept of bodily integrity, the right to control one's own body. And mandatory medical testing or evaluations, even when they're for the public good, can feel like a violation of that right. It's similar to the ethical concerns we discussed around neuroimaging and lie detection.
Absolutely. It's about respecting people's autonomy and their right to make decisions about their own bodies. And this gets even more complicated when you start thinking about the non-consensual use of bodily materials.
Like organ donation after death or post-mortem sperm retrieval.
Yeah. Those are some really weighty philosophical questions about autonomy and the boundaries of individual rights. Who has the right to decide what happens to your body after you die? It's not always clear-cut.
Not at all.
Okay, and moving on, we have the concept of associational privacy.
Which I think is a really interesting one.
It is, and it's about our right to control who is involved in our medical experiences, especially those really intimate moments of suffering, childbirth, recovery, dying.
Right.
And we see this play out in those conflicts over hospital visitation rights.
Right.
Like who gets to be in the room during a difficult birth or during end-of-life care. It's about respecting the patient's wishes and who they want to share those experiences with.
Absolutely. And it can be especially fraught when family members have different ideas about what's best for the patient.
Oh, for sure. And then there's proprietary privacy, which gets into some really fascinating philosophical debates.
Like questions about self-ownership. Do we actually own our bodies and the things they produce?
It gets complicated, doesn't it?
It does. And the famous case of Morvey Regents of the University of California is a great example.
Yeah, the case where a man's cells were used to develop a lucrative cell line without his consent.
Exactly. And the court ultimately ruled that he didn't have property rights over his excised cells. But the case really highlighted the importance of informed consent when it comes to using bodily tissues for research or commercial purposes.
And it's so different from the Henrietta Lacks case,
Oh, absolutely.
where her cells were taken and used extensively without her knowledge or consent, and her family didn't receive any compensation for it.
Right. It was a huge ethical violation.
It was. And it raises all sorts of questions about exploitation and the commodification of human tissues. And these debates are still very much alive today, especially with the rise of biobanking and the collection of genetic information, like what rights do we have over our genes and our genomes? And initiatives like the All of Us Research Program, which involves people voluntarily sharing their health data for research, they raise questions about balancing scientific progress with individual privacy.
Yeah. And then proprietary privacy also comes into play in the realm of infertility medicine, like who controls those gametes and embryos. It often leads to legal battles, especially when couples disagree about what should happen to them.
And even something like medical identity theft is a form of proprietary privacy violation.
Exactly. It's someone using your personal information to gain access to healthcare services or to commit fraud.
Okay, so finally, the encyclopedia addresses decisional privacy, which is using privacy in a slightly different way.
Yeah, some philosophers would argue it's not really privacy in the traditional sense, but it's more about autonomy and the right to make choices about your own health and body.
But it's still a really important concept. And the encyclopedia traces its evolution through history, starting with the fight for access to birth control.
Right. And there was a time when birth control was actually illegal.
It's crazy to think about that now.
I know.
But eventually, the Supreme Court recognized a right to privacy in matters of contraception in the Griswold v. Connecticut case.
Which was a landmark decision.
It was.
Mm.
And feminist perspectives on reproductive rights have been really crucial for understanding how the concept of privacy has been used both to control women's bodies and to empower them.
Absolutely. And then, of course, different religious traditions bring their own moral frameworks to these debates, which adds another layer of complexity.
And then we have the issue of abortion, which is probably the most hotly debated topic when it comes to privacy in medicine.
It is.
And the landmark Roe v. Wade decision, which legalized abortion nationwide in the U.S., was based on the right to privacy.
Right.
But philosophers like Judith Jarvis Thompson have argued that it's more about bodily autonomy. Like, a woman has the right to decide what happens to her own body, regardless of whether or not a fetus is considered a person.
Right. And the ongoing debate about the moral status of the fetus really fuels this ongoing disagreement about abortion.
And it's reflected in the wide range of abortion laws and regulations around the world. Some countries have very liberal laws, while others are incredibly restrictive.
Absolutely. It's one of those issues that really gets to the heart of our deepest values.
It does. And then there's the issue of conscientious refusal by healthcare providers.
Right. This is when a doctor or nurse refuses to provide certain services because it conflicts with their moral or religious beliefs.
It's a really tough one.
It is.
Because you have the patient's right to access necessary care on the one hand,
Right.
and then on the other hand, you have the provider's right to freedom of conscience.
Exactly.
And this comes up a lot in debates around things like abortion and assisted suicide, but it can also apply to other areas of healthcare, like contraception or end-of-life care.
Right. And the debate often focuses on those emergency situations versus more routine care.
Like, if a patient is having a life-threatening emergency, should a doctor be able to refuse treatment based on their personal beliefs?
It's a huge question.
It is. And then, of course, we have all the ethical and philosophical questions raised by assisted reproductive technology, or RT, and the whole realm of enhancements.
Oh, yeah. That's a fascinating area.
Like, do people have a right to procreative privacy? What ethical boundaries should we set when it comes to selecting genetic traits for our children?
The whole designer baby debate.
Right.
And there are so many different philosophical perspectives on that. Like Michael Sandel argues that we shouldn't try to control those things, that we should accept the gift of life as it is. But then you have folks like Alan Buchanan and John Harris who argue that we have a moral obligation to use technology to improve human lives, even if that means tinkering with our genes. It's a huge philosophical can of worms.
It is.
It is.
Okay, and last but not least, the encyclopedia touches on the complex issues surrounding unhealthy lifestyles and the patient's right to refuse life-saving care.
Right.
Libertarian philosophy would say that people should be free to make their own choices, even if those choices are harmful to their health.
Right, the whole my body, my choice argument.
Exactly. But then you have to consider the impact of those choices on society as a whole.
Mm,
Like if someone's unhealthy lifestyle leads to chronic illness, who pays for their health care?
right.
And then there's the issue of social determinants of health. Like, if someone is living in poverty or in a food desert, is it really a free choice to eat unhealthy foods?
It's complicated.
It is.
And the right to refuse life-saving care is another ethically complex issue. We have cases like Quinlan and Cruzan, which establish the legal right of patients to refuse treatment, even if it means they'll die. And this gets really messy when family members disagree about what's best for the patient. The Terescavo case is a heartbreaking example of that.
Absolutely. So many competing interests and values to consider.
Yeah.
Wow. We've covered a lot of ground today. It's clear that privacy in the context of medicine is not a simple concept. It's multifaceted with informational, physical, associational, proprietary, and decisional dimensions. And each dimension raises its own unique set of philosophical and ethical questions.
It does. And for a philosophical mind like yours and our listeners, this really gets at the heart of what it means to be human in an age of rapidly advancing technology. It forces us to think about the relationship between individual autonomy and social responsibility,
Yeah.
and how we balance the pursuit of scientific progress with the protection of fundamental human values.
Absolutely. So here's a final thought for our listeners to ponder. As our health data becomes increasingly interconnected, and as medical technology continues to advance at an unprecedented pace, how do we strike that balance between privacy and progress? What philosophical frameworks can guide us as we navigate this ever-evolving landscape? It's something for all of us to keep thinking about. Until next time.